Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are here with Dr. Wortman, PhD, talking about Bluetooth suffering and you, part one of a two-part series this weekend, next week. Dr. Wortman, all you, my friend.
Awesome. Welcome everybody. As was said, this is going to be kind of more of an introduction. Feel free to stop me and ask questions as they come up. Hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a good enough basic grasp on Bluetooth and kind of what you're thinking about and looking at to then dive into part two with me next week. So, what are we going to go over? Pretty standard stuff. As I said before, we'll go over some history and background, a little bit of kind of what's out there in terms of hardware, software, and tools. And then we'll take a small dive into one aspect of looking at it. It's not quite the RF spectrum, but it is how Linux and the D-Bus see Bluetooth devices. Then we'll talk a little bit about what attacks already exist, the tools used for them, as well as some vulnerabilities that are out there and have been documented. So why are you here? Well, Bluetooth. It's definitely an interesting space. I think the most interesting aspect of it is that slides later. Well, is that basically that you're wirelessly replacing wires. And if you don't understand why it's important for you to understand how those work and how you can sanity check and examine them, um, I don't know how to better explain it to you, but I'm hoping at the end of this talk you'll at least want to understand why. So who am I? I'm a PhD. I'm a Bluetooth security researcher and a research scientist. All that fun disclaimer stuff. This is all my own work and my own research. No one else's. That of any employer, future, past, or present. Yeah. So why do we care about Bluetooth? Well, Bluetooth is a pretty ubiquitous technology. As I said, we are wirelessly replacing wires, and at a rate that is somewhat alarming. And the two best examples that I have for that are the first is a capture of some wiggle war driving that I'm doing in a little puddle jumper airplane that has landed on a landing strip. And this is maybe an 80-person plane. And in a K of having landed, it sees 207 Bluetooth devices. Even accounting for each headphone being a separate device, that is still a lot of stuff. Now, why would you see this sort of ubiquity in Bluetooth? Well, one good example I have is a while back there was an issue with Apple Lightning headphones requiring the use of Bluetooth despite them being wired headphones. And the long and the short of it is that when this journalist or researcher took a deeper look, they essentially found that since it was cheaper to produce wired headphones that didn't completely follow the patented spec, but just changed out the last little connection with a Bluetooth device, that's why. So every one of these wired headphones were so ubiquitous that the people around, I think it's in like Chile. Yeah, that is in Chile. I can just read my own slides. Um, that the people in Chile just knew, like, oh yeah, just turn on your Bluetooth and the headphones work. Yeah, why not? Why shouldn't wired things require Bluetooth? So as I said before, ubiquity of devices, it's a wireless replacement of wires. And the most important part I can tell you is that it gets used for embedded systems. What are embedded systems, you say? Just anything that's kind of Internet of Things. Anything where you've got a limited number of resources that you can use, especially power, and you need to communicate things over small to medium large distances from about 0.1 meters to about 10 meters of distance. Now, this shows up everywhere. Medical, home, your home security system may run it or Zigbee, another popular RF. There are the sensors that read, I forget what they're called in the state I'm in currently, but Easy Pass for the Northeast and I think Sun Pass for Florida. All those passes that you use to end up paying for tolls automatically are also read by a series of street signs that the Department of Transportation has placed sensors up in order to get ideas of traffic flow and things of that nature. So these things are everywhere, whether you enjoy using them or not. Now, as any good talk, let's start with a little bit of trivia. Does anyone know who pioneered the key component of Bluetooth? Well, for those of you who are aware of it, it was Hedy Lamarr. This woman is an actress from the 1940s who was a secret marriage runaway out of 1930s Germany, made a secret life for herself, became a movie star, was a scientific leader, essentially invented the modern airplane wing, but most importantly, figured out how to manipulate radio frequencies. And this was given as a patent to the U.S. Army during World War II as a means of trying to get around radio guided torpedoes. The issue at the time was that the technology was far too large to really be effective. Well, come around the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we're having issues with jamming in the radio spectrum, they recall they've got this patent that Hetty gave for free to the Army, and they had the technology to miniaturize it enough. But this frequency hopping ends up becoming a key component in a lot of current day systems, from Wi-Fi to Bluetooth, and of course was never recognized for any of this stuff, but was just seen as, the most beautiful actress in the world, and secretly led this life as a badass. Now, what is Bluetooth? So, Bluetooth is a spread spectrum frequency hopping protocol. What does that mean? Well, that means over this section of the 2.4 gigahertz band, you've chopped up the space into a series of channels. In the case of Bluetooth Classic, it's 79 of them. And once you are paired to the communication, you essentially have a set hopping pattern that you use to move between all these different channels while communicating. The issue with Bluetooth Classic is that it has huge power requirements and is very talkative, which tends to play hand in hand. And this isn't great for, say, a medical device you're implanting in someone, or a sensor you want to throw out into your lawn to watch for folks, or a doorbell, or any of these embedded systems that have more restrictive power requirements. So we produce Bluetooth Low Energy. And there's some basic simplifications that make it a lot easier to work with. You make it so that pairing only works on 3 specific channels, which does make it a little easier to catch your initial handshake, much like you would see in like HTTP, in the establishment of HTTPS. But past that, you then resume this frequency hopping protocol, and it has much lower power requirements. So you're able to run it on embedded systems a lot better. Now, the most important things about Bluetooth Low Energy, which is what we're going to focus on for today, are these following 2 slides. The first is that the protocol model is relatively simple, but the most important layer that you're going to deal with is this controller layer. And this is the host controller interface. This acts as your layer of abstraction between the hardware and software, and translates whatever software actions or necessary performances you need to do down to your hardware, and vice versa. The most important part about this layer is that you cannot communicate or inject into this layer. You can only listen. I guess by design, but it does make it a key aspect of the Bluetooth standard in order to sanity check yourself as you're watching communication happen. Everything above it is just a build upon this capability, which leads to some ease and some issues down the line. But the most important part, again, is this layer of translation, which will come more into play next week when we talk a little bit about development. But it's a key thing to know now. The second thing I want to make sure everyone is familiar with is the structure of a low energy device. Essentially, what you have is you have a server that has a larger. So here we have profile. I'm still having issues wrapping my head around what exactly a profile represents within the Bluetooth standard, because frankly, the documentation is kind of a pain. But essentially, the way that you can think of it here is that this profile represents a device. And that device is going to have within it a series of services that it can present. Those services will have characteristics, 1 or more, each of which can have their own descriptors. So you get this nested structure within them. And the most important thing about this is that reading any of the value buffers from either the characteristic or the descriptor require 2 reads, or 2 actions, once to populate the buffer and a second time in order to get the information. Okay, so I know that was pretty dense, um, but that does lay a lot of the groundwork for what we're going to talk about going forward. It's relatively straightforward if you think of it as just there's a layer of abstraction that you have to watch, and the structure is a series of nested attributes that all more or less have kind of the same structure. There's a thing, whether it's a service, characteristic, or descriptor, that has some sort of value buffer, and then depending on the layer you are, that's the information that's present. Now, moving on to how do we start actually interacting with Bluetooth, there are surprisingly a lot of options. So hardware wise, some of these are a little older. The Ubertooth one is a classic listener that gets kind of weird and funky. My personal used device is a Sena UD100, which is just a simple Bluetooth adapter. The best part about it, frankly, is that on a Linux device I use that is so old it doesn't have a BLE capability, I can just slap in the adapter and everything works through that. It'll include whatever up to date BLE protocol following goodness I need. And it's generally very easy to use. It behaves well with Windows, Linux. I haven't personally used it on a Mac, but I assume it is also very kind. Your other options, if you want to be a little more in the weeds, is you can get a hack RF or a Blade RF and try to decode RF directly, which is always a great exercise to do, but I find very frustrating trying to decode artifacts and remember all the ESP that I'm not a fan of having to have gone through. The other version you'll find is there's a micro bit, which is essentially like it's almost like a my first Arduino in that it's a little simpler. It has kind of three buttons to it, but it does have some basic BLE testing capabilities and is used by one of the existing attack tools that is out there. And then the last one is, any sort of embedded system device. Now, these run the gamut. ESP32 is a good one since you can also couple that with Wi-Fi and other capabilities. In addition to that, you can kind of use it with Arduino, which kind of works, though it gets into some library gray space, which is annoying. One of the ones that I'm working with most currently is this Realtek RTL 8720 or BW16, which is the one that I will be sharing examples with next week when we go more into kind of development and some of the pain that comes from that. So these are just our hardware choices. What about software? Oh man, it is so much more. It's a painfully large number of libraries that you can use. And MicroPython has a low level Bluetooth library as well as a higher level IOA BLE library. Some of these other ones, honestly, I've tried maybe one or two of them. Other ones are just a Google search, and it's everyone's different flavor of a Bluetooth library. My recommendation is pick one and kind of stick with it unless you hit some very specific issues, which can happen. And if y'all want at the end, I'll tell you more about the pains of trying to find a good Bluetooth library that is well documented. But the most important part is for anyone who's really kind of going out to just learn some very simple basics and just getting some basic code together. Anything by UK Bats on Bluetooth is generally really good and pretty well documented information. You still hit a lot of the same issues that I still find in some of the research I'm doing, but for the most part, it's a good launching point for you to move forward. So, okay, we've gone over hardware, we've gone over software. What's next? Reference material. Um, the one gripe I have, and you will hear me say it more times than I'm sure you care to listen, is the documentation for Bluetooth is just god awful. It is really poor. It's in a few places. I'm sure when I actually get down to reading every page of the Bluetooth spec, it'll all align, but it is really, really painful. So the two main places that I've found that seem to be good documentation is honestly first is the BlueZ reference documentation. It's a Git kernel repo that just has C code, some Python, and the API is documented in a way that While the information is there, it's not always exactly clear how to perform actions, but at least the documentation is there. Your other option is to go to the Bluetooth Special Interest Group that has a hodgepodge Frankenstein of documentation and other information that's kind of helpful sometimes, sometimes not. They've got everything from kind of example code for trying to write some of your own stuff in either C or Python to some beginner 101 stuff, kind of. And then there's, the actual spec because these guys are the maintainers. So if you're getting down into the weeds and trying to build packets or trying to figure out exact bits that need to be written in a certain way to perform specific actions, that is a great place to go. But if you're just kind of getting your feet wet and trying to make sense of it, it's not as helpful as a resource as you'd like. So what's the importance of all this? Well, the importance of all this is that working on Bluetooth is a lot of suffering and very frustrating. So make sure that you pick the right tools to help you out. And much like the hardware and software, there is an obscene number of Bluetooth tools. So the ones that are really useful are like GAT tool and HCI tool, both of which have been depreciated for 8 to 9 years. They're still used super widely. HCI dump is useful in that same sense, but all of these tools have been depreciated and are trying to sort of be wrapped into this Bluetooth CTL, which is a Linux command line for doing Bluetooth device control that, yes, it works, but it's also kind of obtuse as a tool. If you want more visual tools, BetterCap isn't bad. There used to be a tool called Bleh that I liked a lot more because you had a lot more variability in what you could do with it. However, once it got wrapped into BetterCap, it was very tough to use. Blue Soleil was a tool I found on Windows that actually was pretty interesting for Bluetooth Classic. I don't know how useful it is for Bluetooth Low Energy, but my point here is that there is just a lot of tools. Now, the stuff that I would concentrate on are these smaller sets. So these dbus tools we'll get into a little later. The reason for it is that the way in which I have been interacting with Bluetooth devices has been through the Linux dbus. We'll do a bit of a dive into that in a bit. But the most important ones for doing stuff on Linux are these three. Bluetooth CTL, as I said, is kind of the new tool they want you to use. It's a good sanity checking tool for just connecting to a device or enumerating something and kind of getting not only getting a connection, but helping establish it over a long period of time. Because the dbus is really weird and we'll start to kind of forget stuff after a while as a sake of memory management and memory keeping. Bluetooth management, useful for turning LE on. I cannot tell you how many days I have wasted trying to get my tools to work to realize I just had forgotten to turn on low energy capability. But most important here is BTMON. The reason for that is if you recall when I was talking about that HCI layer, BTMON is a tool that will let you sniff that information. There's a lot of data that is presented through there. And it's very key to doing a lot of debugging that we do later on in the development side. What does it look like when you interact with a Bluetooth device? Pretty much this. This is using Bluetooth CTL. And so here there's a device which I have very cleverly named my light orb. It's a smart light in my office. And interacting with it is pretty straightforward. If you want to pair to a device, you're writing pair and the device address. As you see here, it will print out information about attempting to pair to it, failing to do so, and then trying to write some information about it. Here we see that memory garbage collection going on. So, okay, I've just spat a whole bunch of information at you. There's a whole bunch of Bluetooth stuff out there. Cool. Now what, right? Well, now that I've kind of laid a vomitous groundwork for you all to stand on, let's get into a little bit about interacting with these Bluetooth devices and what they look like. And as I said before, the way I do that is through the Linux dbus. That is not to say this is the only way. There was a Armis white paper that came out 2 years ago that did a great job of describing Bluetooth and the Frankenstein of nonsense that has been plaguing my life for the last decade or so. But the main point is that everyone implements the Bluetooth stack in their own special way. And despite there being a Bluetooth standard group, Bluetooth is still the wild freaking West. In that case, as I was saying before, when it comes to choosing hardware, when it comes to choosing software, just pick something. Honestly, you're going to suffer a whole lot more trying to figure out what the best answer is instead of just kind of diving into it. For me, it was the dbus. Why the dbus? It's a code agnostic API. So despite the fact that a lot of the stuff I'm writing is in Python, I can very easily switch over to C and still be able to use some of the base structures that I've been learning. Other than that, it is a Linux message bus that works very much like old network hubs in that every individual on the bus will receive a message, and it is up to their own very special instructions as to whether or not they act on that signal that they've received or whether they ignore it. Now, the most frustrating thing about the Linux dbus is that it is all done with interfaces. And every aspect of that BLE structure, if you recall when I was talking earlier that we've got a device that has a series of services that have their own individual characteristics that then have their own descriptors. Each of those are represented by an interface, which also has multiple interfaces attached to it. Now, for those of you that might have programmed in C or C++, it is somewhat similar in concept, though in practice it's a little more annoying. So whenever we're interacting with a dbus interface, there are some separate pieces. There are methods that essentially act as your functions. There are signals, which are periodic communications that occur that we'll talk about in a little bit. And then there's properties, which are properties. And the way that these interfaces show up is we've got a device interface, as we can see here. A service will have its own type of interface. Properties of anything have their own unique interface. And then there's an introspection interface that you use to examine other interfaces. This is what it looks like. So if we take a look at the tree that is represented for a Bluetooth device on the Linux dbus, it has this structure. This org BlueZ is essentially the tool that we're using. So in this case, we're making use of the BlueZ library. In that library, there's an HCI0 device, much like ETH0 for a network interface. Bluetooth has its naming structure of HCI0. And if you recall earlier, that's why HCI dump is particularly useful. It allows you to capture on that host controller interface. That interface then will have a device, which here you can see that structure of a service having a characteristic, having a descriptor. And here we have a service that has a series of characteristics. The reason that this has this structure is this is me looking at the BLECTF, which of course would have a main service that represents the device itself, and then a service that has a series of characteristics, which are all the different flags that you can capture on that. Now, if we end up introspecting, so if we use that fun interface to take a look at the device itself, this is how it presents itself to kind of the world around it. So what we're doing here is we're using busctl, which is another tool that is useful for inspecting the dbus, and introspecting the BlueZ package, kind of, is a way to think of it, and looking at that specific device with the path that we saw on the earlier slide. Now, this device, as you see, has a device interface. It also has an introspectable interface and a properties interface. There's a series of methods, which at a device level include connecting, disconnecting. Again, we've got this profile thing as well, which, again, as far as I understand, is kind of a means of providing saved information to allow to connect. Still a bit of a pain, but I think that's what profiles are used for. We then have a series of properties where we can see, here's the address for the device. The alias is incorrect because I was throwing flags at it, trying to get it to do stuff and accidentally overrode its name. We can check whether or not we're paired to the device, right? We can see if we've resolved the services on it. This is particularly important because anytime you communicate with a Bluetooth device, it is a relatively simple computer. We'll get more into it next week, but essentially what you're dealing with is a single processor performing actions, and you really have to treat it as such. So one of the ways in which you do this is you have flags that tell you whether or not the BLE device is kind of all done doing what it needs to do. And so when you first enumerate it, it'll tell you whether or not the services are resolved, which is what we see here. In addition, there's some other fun stuff here. There's a signature, which kind of represents the information that that property or method should return. But as you can see, right, it's okay. Kind of looks like maybe if I was looking at a .h file for C code, I kind of get an idea of what's going on here. Well, now comes the fun part, because if you want to dig further into the device, you have to use this introspection interface to call the introspection method on the interface you wish to introspect. Not confusing at all. So what does this produce? Well, what this does is it essentially kicks up an XML map that will give you an introspection into that device. So here we have an example of some code from my tool Bleep that ends up cutting up the result from an introspect method call into a readable human format. And so what we see here is there's a node, which in this case represents a service. We see here there's interfaces associated with that service. So it's got a properties and introspectable interface along with characteristics associated to it. But we see also here that this node is its own characteristic that has its own properties and its own introspectable interface. So very quickly, this can kind of get out of hand in keeping track of what interface goes where. Now, what does it look like if we take a look at a characteristic? We see a very similar structure to what we saw on the device, right? We've got a series of methods here. Instead of a device one characteristic, interface, it's a characteristic interface. We still have this introspectable interface and properties interfaces. We see that some of the properties have changed and the methods might be a little different. But hey, this is pretty familiar and is hopefully starting to make a little more sense as to what you're looking at. Now, how do we interact with these characteristics? If you recall what I said earlier, whenever you read from a characteristic buffer or a descriptor buffer, you'll need to perform that action twice. So essentially, there's two methods towards reading. And the first is you take the characteristic interface and the characteristic properties interface, and you call two separate methods on them. One on the characteristic interface in order to read the information and populate the buffer, and then use that characteristic interface's properties interface to call its get method to then grab the information that's there. Now, what this will provide for you is just the contents of that buffer with none of the other fancy information that come with that. What does that mean? Well, let's show you read method 2. So in the second read method, what you'll do is you'll call the read function twice from just the characteristics interface. And what that will do is it will not only provide you the information that was read, but it will also provide you the signature for that information. Now, what the hell does that mean? If we go back to this slide that shows us the characteristic that we're talking about, or a characteristic that we're talking to, we can see that whenever you've got a return for read, it has a specific signature. So what this means is that when you read from the information, it will tell you not only the value of the information, but the signature associated to it. You can do some fun stuff with that down the line where you can sanity check the data that you're getting back along with what the device expected. But frankly, it's a huge headache and took me way too long to understand what the hell is going on. Now, writes are somewhat as simple. Now, the way that it ended up shaking out is that essentially all you're doing is you're taking the characteristic interface and you're calling the write method, but you can't pass it just a string or an int or anything. You have to provide it a data array in hex. The reason that it has to be a data array in hex is all of the data that you read or write to from a characteristic will be provided as hex data. That is why when we come back to here, this information is provided in hex in this location, only because I was writing hex directly to the device. Tools like busctl, Bluetooth CTL will convert the hex into ASCII because it's expecting that whoever is using this tool will want to read ASCII and not raw hex. But at the HCI layer, Bluetooth doesn't know any better. So everything it does from the information you read back to the information that gets written to it has to be written in hex. The other interesting tidbit that I will also throw at you is that when you are writing to a buffer, generally the buffer size is set at 20 characters, with I think the 21st character being a null terminator. Now, it is possible to configure that separately because, again, Bluetooth is the Wild West, and why not just build anything any way that you feel like? But for the most part, writes just work in this manner. You can send it a set of hex. If you want to send it more than 20 characters, you just have to write multiple times. Now, that was reading and writing. Easy, right? You just have to keep track of a bunch of interfaces that are not confusing at all and not at all interchangeable. And just call the write methods or read and write. Now, what about signals and emissions? These are a little more complicated based on the solution you are using. And I have found that working with them in Python just is an endless ball of fun. But basically what signals and emissions are you're sending messages asynchronously. So if you recall earlier when I was saying that the dbus acts as a network hub, the signals and emissions are essentially those packets of data that you're sending that folks decide whether to interact with or not. The main points that you need to know about this are one, that you need to register your interest in a signal. So if you want to catch the notification that some information from the Bluetooth device, like an outdoor sensor that has temperature, has changed, you need to say, okay, well, I want to catch this information. And then secondly, you need to provide a callback function. So some action that you're going to perform when you get that received signal. Now, according to the BT-SIG documentation, which as we all know is wonderful and well documented, this is essentially how signal notification capture is supposed to work. So what we are doing is first you have to take one of those interfaces that you want to capture the signal for, and you have to enable its notification method. Now, once you have essentially turned on notifications for this characteristic, you then start a thread that is going to capture those notifications. And when that emission is caught, it's going to call some sort of property changed callback function that will do something with that value. And then once you're done, you turn off notifications and you stop doing stuff. The best way I have found to visualize this is it is the equivalent to trying to listen to the radio in your car with the car turned on. What does that mean? Well, your enabling notifications is essentially turning on the radio, and your intent to signal is setting it to a specific station. The problem is that doesn't work if your car isn't on. So you can set the radio, but you're not going to capture anything until the engine is running and the radio is powered. Once that happens, you'll catch the signal and get the audio, and it'll work. Once you're done listening to the radio, you turn the radio off, and then you turn your car off because there's no point in keeping the car running while it's working. So from this magnificent documentation they gave me, I essentially figured out, okay, there's about 6 things really I need to keep track of, right? I need to be able to capture and parse the signal that's being sent to me. I need to be able to stop the car engine from running when I'm done with it. I have to configure these things so that they have the correct interfaces and have everything set up before I start the car running. because the dbus is fun like that. Then, I should probably validate what I'm getting. Make sure that I'm running threads correctly because threads can get kind of tricky. You can end up with zombies and other fun things that end up eating up your resources, especially for embedded systems. And then I should act on that data. So what did that lead me to? Well, essentially, I found really what the way in which you should be capturing the information is like this. And so what I did was in Bleep, I created essentially two threads. A main thread, which is our car engine just running all the time. I set up my desire to want to capture a notification, and I prepare a thread, which is essentially our radio, and say, okay, I want you to capture this signal. I want you to run for only this amount of time and then turn off. And then if you see the signal, I want you to write a message to some location, and that will be kind of my proof. And so when you are capturing any signal or emission, the key point here is that you actually need two running processes, which gets very tricky when you start working with embedded Bluetooth devices. We'll get a little bit more into that next week, but essentially it's the source of a lot of problems because a BLE embedded device can't do many things together. So in order to get this dual thread method working, you have to do a lot of multiplexing, which can lead to a lot of heartache. So that's all the boring stuff. Hopefully that wasn't too awful of a crash course on some basics of Bluetooth and how it functions. Now what I'd like to get into are what are the tools that are out there? What are some of the fun things that folks have already built, as well as a quick review of some vulnerabilities, because frankly, there's a good amount of them that are out there, and the key overlying concepts that are of how they work. So, custom tools that are out there. My two favorite ones that I started playing with are BLE Juice and BLE Jack. These are developed by a researcher, I believe, out of Belgium, who had some very good talks about 5 or 6 years ago. The point of these two are somewhat similar, but uniquely specific. So BLE Juice is meant to be a man in the middle. Its key point is that it will create a fake device. The main issue that I've had with it as a tool is the fake device it creates is somewhat limited, and I'm sure by design so that the tool isn't too crazy out of the box. The specific issue that I found was in trying to clone like a headset so that I could sit in between some audio being sent. I could clone the name correctly, but the type of device that I was presenting myself as was as a computer instead of as a headset, which caused some heartache. BLE Jack is a little more interesting. What it does, it ends up hijacking connections. So what I tested this with was one of the Pokemon Go controllers for the Pokemon Go Switch game. And essentially, what this does is it sits on the BLE spectrum over those three channels. And the way it does it is it uses three of those microbit embedded devices. And it sits on each of those channels all at once. And then once it sees a pairing occur, it then grabs the pairing and then brute forces the nonce that is used to establish the frequency hopping pattern. And then at that point, you can sit in between and just watch as all the hexes being sent between the two devices. And I believe it allows for some read write. It's a fun tool to use. It is difficult in that you have to capture that initial handshake, which sometimes is a pain. But past that, just a fun tool, though it does require 3 of those microbits. Now, one that I'm less familiar with is this GAT Tacker. Now, the reason I have this up here is, as I said before, the Bluetooth SIG puts out some interesting documentation and examples out. And one of the things that I've noticed is a big push for Node.js control of BLE devices. And I'm not sure why, or I'm not sure exactly why, a web server or a web browser would need to control Bluetooth devices. I can imagine reasons why. But this seemed like a really odd shift about 2 or 3 years ago that the Bluetooth SIG did in releasing a bunch of Node.js example code. The main point of it, again, is to work as a man in the middle. I haven't had as much time to play with that one. Some other tools that are out there that you may be more familiar with are Blue Snarfer and Blue Diving, which are attacking tools and penetration suites that I have not played with too much. SpoofTooth is a tool that allows for spoofing. Though I found that I was having issues in getting the masquerading to work, and I think it was just a lack of understanding of the protocol at the time. BLE Fuzz is a fuzzer that I don't know if you can get the link to anymore, because I think it was hosted by this person in France on a website that I think the link no longer exists, which is unfortunate. But essentially, what it did was it just started fuzzing packets at BLE devices in an attempt to kind of crash them. Bluetooth Stack Smasher was the same thing for Bluetooth Classic. GUR Bluetooth is a GNU radio tool for interacting with Bluetooth with the Hack RF1. Ubertooth BTLE is, again, another tool for sniffing. Blue Ducky is one I started to play with that essentially seems to exploit a more recent, exploit. I'm going to use heavy quotations for exploit because I'm not bitter about them getting a CVE at all. But it was a more recent Bluetooth attack that essentially leverages the use of an Android keyboard to just connect to a device. It's basically rubber ducky through Bluetooth. That one I have gotten to work a little bit with, which is always fun to play with, though I haven't gotten to make any fun payloads with it yet. In the interest of giving you guys as much access to resources as possible, a great place to look for Bluetooth tools, as much as I'm sure a groan will pass through the room with some gray beards. Black Arch's repos are pretty good at least cataloging some of these older tools. Yes, this is where you all find out that my research machine is all in Arch, and I hope you don't hold it against me. Now, in terms of training against Bluetooth devices, CTFs are. So I would say that these two tools, while I haven't worked with the Affinity yet, the BLE CTF is probably the best training device that I have found for getting basic Bluetooth capability off the ground. The reason for that is that it's relatively approachable. It doesn't use any vendor specific codes or functionality. It doesn't require reverse engineering an app to understand what the heck it is they're trying to send back and forth. It is pretty much the most open to talk to you Bluetooth device that you can find, which is great for prototyping a tool, but very difficult when you want to start doing fun things. Now, the same person, Hacknar, also made a BLF CTF Infinity, which is an upgraded version of it, which does actually some pretty cool stuff. So if you recall earlier when I was talking about the structure of Bluetooth and you have this GATT server, essentially what the CTF Infinity does is it has several GATT servers on it. And we'll get a little bit more into this specific functionality next week. But whenever you establish a GATT server, you are setting that sucker in stone until the device is turned off and turned on again, which is why you only ever run one GATT server at a time. The way the CTF Infinity gets around it is that it ends up kind of doing a soft shutdown and selecting a different GATT server in memory in order to present GATT servers nested within GATT servers, which is awesome. I just have to figure out how to reflash my BLE CTF well enough that I can recover it without frying my own equipment in the process. Now, that's attack tools and some training stuff. Now for some more interesting stuff, let's talk about vulnerabilities that are out there or that are well documented. Now, here's just a few. There are a bunch. If you search Bluetooth and vulnerability, you'll find stuff reaching way back into early Classic, a lot of OBX stuff, which is the Bluetooth Classic file system, sort of, is a good way to think of it. The ones that are a little more recent are these. We've got Bracktooth, we've got Blueborn, Knob. This CVS from 2023 is the one that I spoke ill of earlier. We'll get into why in a moment. So Knob is the key negotiation of Bluetooth. Essentially, what this allowed you to do was attack the encryption key. And if you kind of massaged everything really well and you set the entropy just the right way, you could decrypt and eavesdrop on ciphertext, which is always bad. The main thing that is a limit here is that this is for BR-EDR, which is, I believe, classic, because it's basic rate, extended data rate, which I believe is before classic, or sorry, before low energy, which I think comes out in spec 4.0. An interesting attack, but much like a poodle attack or any other sort of rollback attack, you are forcing the scenario in which encryption is being performed to be as breakable as possible. Now, Bracktooth attacked the link manager, which allows for some arbitrary code execution. Reading into the publication on it, it really required a very specific knowledge of the firmware layout. Since we're attacking the link manager, this is not quite at the HCI layer, but it's kind of sitting right above it, which is why a lot of the majority of attacks are seen as denial of service or crashes. You're basically messing with the Bluetooth's ability to handle all of the information you're sending to it. Again, it's kind of a single processor computer. But in the case that you know how all the architecture is laid out and you know how the firmware sits, you can do things like achieve arbitrary code execution. Now, Sventooth was a set of vulnerabilities that came out. A lot of it is, again, crashes and deadlock. Security bypass really comes down to the spec. As I said before, the spec is a little wild. I think the best description I've found of it was from the Armis 2023 paper. Essentially, the Bluetooth spec is a Frankenstein monster of protocols, and what Sventooth here is really exploiting is how all these different protocols interact. To give you an idea of kind of size, and I'm sure it's not exact numbers, so I'm spitballing a bit here, but if we say like the Wi-Fi standard is like 600 pages, Bluetooth standard is 220, or sorry, 2200 pages. So a couple times that size, which means that people can make lots of mistakes and well, leave unintended vulnerabilities in place that can be exploited. Now, Bluffs is a little more interesting. This is a little more recent in Bluetooth vulnerability history. It's essentially 6 novel attacks that allow you to break security. It does have a toolkit with it, which is interesting, and I can't say that I've played with it because I did find it as I was coming up from air from my recent bout of research. But it does allow for some impersonation of man in the middle. So much like I said earlier with BTLE, Jack and Juice, it provides you some of that capability by really exploiting kind of the protocol and how things act within the architecture. Blueborn, this was part of the vulnerability that was released in that 2023 Armis paper. It is very interesting, but again, very complex, because what you are doing is you are leveraging capabilities within the standard itself and how objects interact within it in order to bypass things like not requiring authorization. And it's difficult to bug Bluetooth, which is why it's full of holes, which is both fortunate and unfortunate. Another one that really upsets me is this one. This is that CVE 2023 that basically Blue Ducky leverages. It's basically a just works mode. What it is essentially exploiting is that when you're pairing between devices, you need to present yourself as a specific type of device. So if you recall earlier when I said that the BTLE Juice device, I had issues with man in the middle because I wasn't presenting myself as the correct item. What this is exploiting is it is saying, okay, well, if I tell you I want to pair to a Bluetooth device and I don't have a terminal, how am I supposed to provide a response code or match any code whatsoever? And so because engineers want to prove that this stuff works and that I can get it functional, there's a just works mode, because a keyboard isn't going to necessarily have a monitor, so it functions. This vulnerability was essentially them reading the standard and saying, hey, you shouldn't be doing it this way. And I kick myself every day because I saw the same thing in the standard and thought, wow, this is just cool to have. I can use it for debugging my own research. Um, yeah. Uh, please ask questions. If you have any about it, I will gladly go into depth on any of this. My own shameless plug is I have a tool for playing around with Bluetooth at the command line level. It is written for Linux, and all it requires is a Sena UD100. Requirements are in the GitHub repo. Other than that, I've got more advanced slides if you guys want to go more into depth into stuff. Um, thanks for coming to my talk.
Oh, I just realized I'm muted. You guys hear me?
Yes, I do now.
Oh, perfect. All right. Oh, super cool, interesting stuff. I'm just curious. When you were doing all this research, what was like the weirdest, quirkiest thing you found about Bluetooth attacks that you were kind of like, maybe it was an aha moment, or just something that was like really interesting from an attack perspective?
I think the most fascinating thing I have found um on a more offensive side was I was trying to get around some really weird behavior that I was seeing with Apple devices out in the wild. So if anyone remembers 2 DEF CONs ago, there was that whole, what was it, bad Apple attack with the flippers that were basically causing Apple devices to DOS and freak out because they were being overloaded with Bluetooth advertisement packets. So in the last couple of years, I've been trying to get a general set enumerator working that allows for just seeing what these devices look like and interacting with them. And what I kept noticing was whenever I was enumerating an Apple device, despite the fact that I wasn't actually trying to do anything with it, once I started communicating to certain characteristics or services, the device would just freak out and stop talking to me. And so what I essentially found was, oh, the way that Apple got around this attack was they basically just said, okay, well, if you're trying to read certain characteristics or talk to me in a certain way, and I haven't authenticated myself to you, then I'm just going to freak out and stop talking to you. And that is how I will stop attacks from happening. Cool. Except I can remember what I was doing last time and just continue asking you about the rest of your capabilities. And the reason that that was so important is the way in which Bluetooth devices enumerate each other is, again, really rudimentary. So when you start enumerating a device, it goes all the way through from the beginning of some range to the end of some range. And generally, the way it's done is, well, I don't know what's on this device, so tell me about everything. And then once you get everything back, you say, okay, well, I want to look at this piece of data that you have, and I want to look at this slice of data that you have, and I want to look at this slice of data that you have. Whereas if I could just keep track of which slices of data cause you to freak out, I can now just take a look at your entire device and say, okay, this is the layout of what's there, and these are the areas that you don't want me to look at, so let me figure out how to dig in deeper. And that right now is where a lot of my research is hitting a wall. Because surprisingly, the way in which Bluetooth security is implemented is still really left up to the developer, which means it could go any way you want. So what I found is that there's a few specific criteria that you kind of have to meet whenever you are diving into one of these vulnerabilities or trying to get one of these tools working, or even just trying to interact with a device. Is one, if depending on how you present yourself, BLE devices will sometimes act differently. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that if I connect to an audio device as a laptop, it will present itself in one specific way and say, hey, I'm an audio device, I've got these capabilities, and then may or may not freak out because you're just a laptop. However, if I present myself as, oh, well, I'm actually a laptop that has audio capabilities, and look at these speakers I have, all of a sudden the device becomes a lot more chatty because now you've met and this is where I think I'm using the terminology correctly, an expected profile based on your device type, which then begs to differ the question. If people are writing these devices kind of in their own way, what's to stop them from setting up a device to interact as a debug mode if I present myself the right way. So what if I, instead of presenting myself to an audio device as a laptop, I present myself as a signal generator? I mean, for the sake of just using words. Or what if I present to myself as a temperature device, which is, I think, really going to be useful, because a lot of the research that is currently in line with this Armis paper, with the Bluffs vulnerability and the writing in that, the biggest issue is that the documentation isn't out there, and a lot of this is us figuring it out. And from what little conversation I've been able to get out of people that do work in the more official Bluetooth SIG space, it appears that there's an NDA you have to sign that is in there. And I don't know about you all, but I'd much rather be able to share information on Bluetooth in an open manner so we can get better at this stuff and have better security implemented for all these BLE devices. They're freaking everywhere. So I know that was a bit of a rant, but the summary of what I was saying is that I think the most unique thing that I've seen that has really confounded me is that Bluetooth devices are frankly, it's a wild west. Is that even now, even with the tools that I use for sniffing that HCI layer, there is a lot more vendor specific and unknown stuff out there than I would expect to see for a protocol that has a group that writes a standard, and not just a standard, but is on like version 6 of this spec. And it kind of horrifies me. There's definitely some interesting stuff in the new spec that I want to dive into, including the ability to have multiple listeners on a single audio source. And once again, I get back to the question of, okay, so who's deciding how these things will interact? Yes, the spec has some vague outline of it, but does that mean that the companies and developers that are writing the code that goes onto this hardware are doing anything unified? Are they all doing it their own special way? And it leads to some pretty horrific scenarios that I think are again worth investigating. And I will keep talking if no one else has any other questions and tell you more about the fun stuff Bluetooth 6 can do.
Dr. Wortman, I had a comment and a question. What you were talking about, the misrepresentation of the device type or class. I mean, isn't this no different than, every USB device is a keyboard?
Yeah, it absolutely is. It 100% is, and we only treat Bluetooth as a different sort of concept because it is wireless wires. And there's no reason to. It's part of my motivation for really diving into this space is that a lot of these Bluetooth devices are the equivalent of just plugging in a USB.
And then my question would be, speaking from a pair of wired headphones right now, is there any of these tools or libraries if I wanted to check that? I mean, look, I'm sure most of the people in this call have a bunch of different Bluetooth devices lying around the house, whether or not you're a security researcher or not. Is there any particular tool where I could check for a known vulnerability without going too crazy in the setup? Like if I wanted to tell my mom or dad, hey, there's a way to check those Bluetooth headphones you got, or is it just really not worth the time?
So one that I haven't looked into that I think might be worth investigating is Bluffs, only because they did put together a toolkit for it. I don't know how involved that is. Otherwise, my recommendation is unfortunately a two-part, which is there is a tool called Blue Hydra, which I think was back in the software part. But essentially what this does is it does device sniffing and tracking. And while that sounds really basic, what it will do is it will create a database that just captures all of that Bluetooth information for you. And your best way of finding if your device is vulnerable is to process that data and just search. Do I have a Bluetooth device that is using the specific spec? And right now that's kind of it. You can throw some tools at stuff. So for like the fuzzer, what was it? BLE fuzz BLE fuzz v2.1.sh or the stack smasher. You can kind of just throw fuzzing at it and see if it will fall over. But otherwise, no, not really. At least not that I've found. I'm sure there are folks that have written stuff up for very specific devices like Philip Hue light bulbs. I think there's a few tools out there for interacting with those. But in terms of a uniform Bluetooth scanner, not that I'm aware of.
No, that's awesome. And so we'll go ahead and do, if there's no other questions, John, if you we can go ahead and end this stream, and we can continue short after hours talk, not on stream, if anyone had questions that they didn't want to just throw out there on the stream. But
All right. Sounds like a